Some of you know Dr. Dan Scholes. He is a wonderful speaker. He's been here many times talking about the scriptures. But what I like about him is he puts it more into our practical knowledge. And he talks about the fact that the land of Israel is a very small country. In our area, the land of Israel would go from Sheboygan to Chicago and from Madison to Lake Michigan. That's the whole country of Israel. And can you imagine the significance of that little piece of land throughout history? So today in the gospel, because we usually approach Jesus in the temple, and we attribute that Mary and Joseph had some very poor parenting, leaving without Jesus. But remember that the people of Nazareth was a small town, so they all knew each other. So the people that went from Nazareth down to Jerusalem, which would be like Port Washington to Chicago, for the Passover, would travel in a group, because they wouldn't travel alone. They traveled in a group for safety. So returning home, it would be very easy for this group to go a day's journey looking for Jesus. Now that's the usual way we approach it from the point of view of Mary and Joseph. But approach it from the point of view from Jesus. Maybe he didn't want to go back home. Maybe things weren't going so good. If any of you have had a runaway child, you know what that's like. Or if you had a lost child. Or maybe you are alienated from your child for whatever reason. So you can get a little bit into that significance. Remember that Jesus he didn't reject the faith of his ancestors, but he came to reform it. Because a lot of us talk about the fact that our children don't go to church. Now, if I think of it, I'll get back to that later in my comments. Or maybe Jesus was a rebellious adolescent. If you've ever had to deal with a rebellious adolescent, or maybe you were one. I was one. As an adolescent, I couldn't get along with my father. If he said up, I said down. If he said black, I said white. If he said go forth, I said go back. I don't know why. And remember that I wanted to be a priest ever since I can remember. So that didn't spare me from being an absolutely most rebellious adolescent. So what were you like? So that's part of the gospel today. From Jesus's point of view. And if you've ever been one of those adolescents, then you probably were different outside of your home. I don't know how many of you get the Catholic Herald, but this last week, Father Joe Giacconialis writes articles once in a while. But this is what he wrote. With a bit of a smile, John tells me he suspects that most parents are given the wrong children to raise. When I asked why so, he goes on to explain how so many of his friends and neighbors tell him how wonderful his 14-year-old son Jason is. They say Jason is so polite, friendly, cooperative, pleasant to be around. They tell me how lucky he is, how lucky I am to have him as a son. But then John rolls his eyes and explains that this is not the Jason that lives in his house. How about you? Were you part of that as well? As some of you know, I like to look at the trends of society. Because so often we're caught up in trends that society is moving, shifting, but we don't even realize it. So my amateur analysis is that in our society today, we are maturing later because we live in such a land of comfort. We don't have to endure much hardship as we're growing up. Hardship matures us. So a lot of people, for instance, that come to get married are not mature enough to get married, although they still do. And what I mean by that is they're not mature enough they come to get married thinking what they can get out of the marriage, their spouse, and also life. They're not mature enough to be able to be willing to sacrifice for their spouse or their children. And they still have children. You don't have to have any brains to conceive a child, but you have to be mature to really parent a child. So because of that, if I'm somewhat right, of the later maturing of us, that's why one of the reasons that we have an increase in divorce and single parenting, child abuse, children that live alone, they come home from school, latchkey children, and so on. And we complain about the absence of family values, and we think somebody else should do it. We are the ones that have to bring forth family values. So the second letter today from Colossians says, if we are mature, and remember all of us are on the way to that, no, I don't think anybody is perfect, we're supposed to exemplify compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. To bear with one another, forgive any complaint against one another. So if we are mature as parents, we're supposed to exemplify for our children what all of this is about. So ideally speaking, why do you get angry? Usually we get angry when somebody pushes our buttons and we don't know what else to do, so we blow up. So parenting is to give example to our children. We should not expect our children to be perfect. We are the ones as adults who are supposed to give that good example, but we don't do it. That's why it says also, bear with one another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must be forgiven. So parents are challenged to be mature, to give an example of what mature living is, and to remember that parents are parents. So many people today, again, I think because of a lack of maturity, they want to be friends with their children. Parents are not children's friends. They're their parents. And the hardest thing for a parent to do is to say no, that this is not allowed for you. Now, most of us treat others better than our spouses and our children. Think about it. How do you treat your customers or your clients or your neighbors or your coworkers or even strangers? How many of us have been in violent arguments and then the phone rings? Hello. We've all been there, haven't we? So that's the challenge, to treat those close to us with the words of Paul from Colossians. So Joe Giaconellis and the families today seem to be bombarded with much more pressure than previous eras. So Father Joe in his article talks about family trials. He talks about the trials of adolescence, grown children returning home, a son or daughter's choice of a spouse, the onset of lifelong struggles, illness, addictions, unexpected divorce or separation, a gay son or daughter, issues dealing with mental health, children with special needs, incarceration and its consequences, religious faith not shared by adult children. And I wonder, as I said earlier to comment, I wonder if our children don't go to Mass because we haven't lived out the real values that we profess here. And children see the lack of consistency, that what we do here, we should live in they call it the domestic church, which is our homes. And when children see our inconsistency, that's why they have a tendency to reject it, just as we did with our parents. Our parents taught us what to do and what not to do. Now, underneath all of that, such a heavy burden, isn't it? We're also meant to celebrate today that family life should be fun. It should be enjoyable, something we look forward to, something that nourishes us. So I found this article that perhaps will exemplify the fact that family life changes us, whether we like it or not, and hopefully makes us better. So, for example, if you are a mom, your clothes change. With the first baby, you begin wearing maternity clothes as soon as the gynecologist confirms your pregnancy. With the second baby, you wear regular clothes as long as possible. With your third baby, your maternity clothes are your regular clothes. Your attitude toward germs changes. With the first baby, if the pacifier falls on the floor, you put it away until you can go home and wash it and boil it. With the second baby, when the pacifier falls on the floor, you squirt it off with some juice from the baby's bottle. With the third baby, you wipe it off on your shirt and put it back in. Your attitude toward going out changes. With the first baby, the first time you leave your baby with a sitter, you call home 5 times. The second baby, just before you walk out the door, you remember to leave a number where you can be reached. With the third baby, you leave instructions for the sitter to call only if he or she sees blood. Your attitude toward the being with the baby changes. With the first baby, you spend a good bit of every day gazing at your baby. With the second baby, you spend a bit of each day watching to be sure your older child isn't squeezing, poking, or hitting the baby. With the third baby, you spend a bit of each day hiding from your children. And your attitude towards swallowing coins changes. When the first baby swallows a coin, you rush the baby to the hospital and demand x-rays. When the second child swallows a coin, you carefully watch for the coin to pass. When the third child swallows a coin, you deduct it from their allowance. Family life should be fun. Enjoy it because it makes us better. Thank you for watching the Christmas homily here at St. Elizabeth Ann Seton Parish. We wish you a very Merry Christmas and a blessed holiday season. Please, you're invited to join us for weekend liturgy anytime you might be in the area. Or you can visit us always at mysaintelizabeth.com or watch us on Facebook. Thank you again and blessed Christmas.